Hey guys, what's going on? Shaw here, and today in this video we are talking all things trinkets related to Mythic Plus. Now I'm going to be going over what the most powerful or most popular trinkets have been to run for each of the 6 tanks. While we will be talking mostly about Mythic Plus, the trinkets do drop from all sorts of content, so I will cover those individually. To start off the video, we will talk about general best in slot trinkets for most of the tanks across the board, and then we'll get into specifics. If you're looking for a specific class, feel free to use the timeline below. Anyways, let's dive in. Let's start off with the general best tank trinkets that can be used across all types of classes. So starting off with the raid, we do have the Decoration of Flame from Aranog. Now this is the first boss of the instance, and it can provide a pretty massive amount of snap threat on pull on a 2-minute cooldown, as well as a pretty hefty absorption shield. This has been a popular choice for almost every single tank, and if you're able to get your hands on it, I recommend running it. And then the other trinket from the raid that has been pretty stand out-ish is the Whispering Incarnate Icon from the Primal Council. While this trinket doesn't really scream anything glamorous, it is a pretty solid stat stick, and for tanks this is going to give you main stat and versatility. Now, what's cool about this trinket though is it actually will give you additional secondary stats based on other players in your party who are also using this trinket. So if you have a healer using it or a DPS using it, you're going to gain also crit and haste depending on what specs you have. So if you are after 2 of the raid trinkets, I do recommend the Decoration of Flame or the Whispering Incarnate Icon. Now there are some other good raid trinkets, but I'm going to get to those in a little bit when I talk about specifics. Now regarding Mythic Plus, there are 2 solid trinkets you should actually be aiming for. First, I would always recommend a Windscar Whetstone from Court of Stars. This is just a really solid mastery stat stick that does a ton of damage on a 2-minute cooldown. This will allow tanks to actually have very high single target, or will provide that snap threat that's needed for some of the tanks outside of their cooldowns. If you're able to get your hands on this, I recommend doing so, but keep in mind that you're not able to actually loot it in your tank spec. You'll have to make sure your specialization is swapped to DPS when you're finishing your Court of Stars run. And the last tank trinket from Mythic Plus that I would recommend that you see kind of across the board across all tanks is Granite's Enduring Scale. This is a passive stat stick trinket that will actually grant you absorption shields every once in a while once you take damage. Just kind of a nice passive, you don't have to think about it, set it and forget it, absorption shield trinket. It will result in decent overall healing, but it works better for some tanks than others, but I'll get to that in a bit. And last but not least, there is one trinket I do want to mention. It's actually the Primal Ritual Shell, and this is a trinket that drops from world rares, so you kind of got to do the daily farm to get that. Now, while it can only ever really peak out at like a 385 item level, even at 385 or 379 or whatever you happen to get it at, it can provide a massive absorption kind of on a random proc throughout a Mythic Plus run. This can pretty much be the life and death of your tank. So if you have any free time, I recommend camping some rares in Brackenhide or in the Obsidian Citadel. Alright, so now we finished that up, so let's talk specifics. We're going to start with the Protection Warrior really quick and go through some of the trinkets that you're going to see here. So similar to like I just said in the kind of the general classification of trinkets, you're going to see your Decoration of Flame, you're going to see your the Windscar Whetstone, and you're going to see that Granite Enduring Scale, as well as that Whispering Incarnate Icon. You're going to see a massive amount of pairing of these, but some other standouts are going to be the Rumbling Ruby from Raid. This is going to provide you with a fair bit of DPS increase. It's just passive, so as you're in combat, you're going to gain attack power per stack, and then once you hit 10 stacks, your next melee abilities will just emit a shockwave in front of you, dealing a bunch of nature damage. And then what's really cool about this is that the shockwaves actually do more damage based on the enemy's health. So if the enemy has higher health, it's going to do a ton of damage. Now Warrior, what's unique about Warrior and similar to Blood Decay, which I'll talk about in a second, is that they're able to just not really care too much about defensive value because their kit is so strong. They have things like Spell Reflect, they have Spell Block, they have just like Last Stand, they have Shield Wall, they have just like this immense amount of healing from Ignore Pain and their Leech that they get passively. So Warriors are just in such a good spot that they can actually lean a little bit more into the offensive trinkets than the defensive trinkets. Some other standouts will be like the Burgeoning Seed from Azure Vaults, or if you're able to kill Razagat, the Spiteful Storm, but this trinket is mostly single target based, and honestly the reason that they probably were running it in this key in general was probably just item level. This player probably had a heroic or a mythic level, which probably exceeded all of their other trinkets that they may have had access to. So any of those trinkets would be good for the Warrior. Let's jump over to the Blood Death Knight next. So similar to the Warrior, but actually a little bit more on the damage side, you're going to see a ton of damage trinkets coming out from the Blood Death Knight. And this is because they have things like AMS, they have Rune Tap. If they run Blood Tap, they have that. They have things like Purgatory and a cheat death. They have Icebound Fortitude, AMZ, Death Strike healing alone is insane. They're also getting a lot of different like leech values from like their Blood Plague being out, as well as after they Death Strike. Just Blooded Knights are so tanky right now that they can play very offensively with their trinkets. So you're going to see a mass majority. It's fucking same thing. You're going to see a ton of players running the Windscar Whetstone, which is a huge DPS increase. Also, it gives a fair bit of mastery, so that's not bad for their Blood Shield build. And you'll see them running things like the Rumbling Ruby, the All Totem Master. This is like a counter attack trinket, which when you get hit, when you dodge or parry an attack, you're going to strike back at the attacker, dealing some type of damage. It's going to be either like nature, fire, frost, and it's going to basically, it's just like, can proc every 30 seconds. So it's an okay trinket for damage. It's fairly defensive because you do counter attack off the attack, but mostly you're going to see things like the Grief Torch, the Storm Eater's Boon, and actually surprisingly you're seeing a few people running the Idling of Trampling Hooves. This trinket was buffed recently. I would say if you can get your hands on any of these other raid trinkets, that's a good thing to do, but again, not everyone raids. There are some people who strictly Mythic Plus, and if that's you, then focus on maybe getting one of these. You do see a few Blooded Knights running Decoration of Flame as another defensive option, which is fine, but a well-played Blooded Knight shouldn't need to rely on these too much. All right, let's look at Protection Paladin next. Now, Protection Paladin is a pretty cool class because you're going to see a variety of different trinkets being ran, but like I said before, you're going to have that Decoration of Flame and the Granite's Enduring Scale along with the Whetstone, but the Whetstone isn't being ran as much, but instead, Paladins value haste. So the Blazebinder's Hoof from Ruby Life Pools is a great choice. It is an on-use trinket on a 2-minute cooldown, but you'll gain strength every time you attack. And once you hit 6 stacks, you'll deal a ton of fire damage. It's pretty cool. There are some also running the Alchemist Stone, which is a crafted item. And it's actually reducing the cooldown of their combat potions, but it's also, the main reason they're running this is because of the immense amount of haste that it gives you. So because Paladin is a little bit more haste-centric, you're going to see more of these haste-based trinkets, and you're just seeing the double defensive in some situations where they're running Decoration of Flame with Granite Scale, or Decoration of Flame with All Totem Master, or Decoration of Flame with like Whispering Incarnate Icon. But the two big standouts here are going to be your Alchemist Trinket, which is kind of odd, or your Blazebinder Hoof. Moving on to the Vengeance Demon Hunter. Now, the big standouts here is you're going to see a lot of the same trinkets that we've already talked about, so Decoration of Flame, Granite Scale, Whetstone, but because this is an agility tank, unlike the Paladin, they have access to different trinkets. And similar to Paladin though, they love haste. So you're just going to see your Windswept Pages coming out of the Jade, Temple of the Jade Serpent, which really, really good. This actually has a pretty high proc rate, so you have a very high uptime on that haste value, and the haste value is pretty significant where it'll make your general rotation and your ability to generate fragments and consume fragments much faster. And you're also seeing that Bottle of Spiraling Winds, which is coming out of actually the Naku defensive. So what's nice about this is you can actually kind of double farm these trinkets by farming Granite Scale as well as the Battle of Spiraling Winds, but those are really the big standouts for the Demon Hunter. Another thing that you're seeing a lot of is the All Totem Master, because they spend a lot of their time parrying attacks. So you're going to get a lot of value out of the All Totem Master, but again, if you don't raid, not really worth trying to go for, but very powerful trinket nonetheless. All right, we are reaching kind of towards the end of this list, but I do want to talk about Brewmaster. Again, similar to before, you're seeing a ton of Granite Scales in this case. It has a very interesting dynamic with Stagger, but you're also seeing that Decoration of Flame, you're seeing that Whetstone for big damage, but for the first time out of all of these tanks, we are seeing the Primal Ritual Shell, which is something that I talked about earlier in the video, and this is a strong trinket for any tank, but most other tanks have really strong trinkets as well, where they can replace this pretty easily. But for pure survivability value, the Primal Ritual Shell is really good for the item level it is actually dropped at. But outside of that, you're going to see your very standard tank trinkets like I've already said. All right, last but not least, I do want to talk about the Guardian Druid. Now, there's a couple standouts here that you're going to see. First off, not as many people playing Guardian Druid as other tanks, so the data might seem a little off, but similar to the Monk, you are seeing that Primal Ritual Shell, very solid trinket, but the other biggest standout here is going to be that Horn of Valor from Himdall from the Halls of Valor. What's really cool about this trinket is it's a versatility stat stick, which is Guardian Druid's one of their better stats, but their Incarnation, which is kind of their major cooldown, with the CDR talent can be actually reduced to a 2-minute CD. And because of that, you're actually able to pair this with Incarnation, which makes Incarnation as well as this trinket really, really strong, because you have one of the stronger tank cooldowns in the game, as well as a very powerful trinket to coincide with that. So you're seeing this ran in a few different scenarios, but you're mostly going to see the typical Decoration of Flame alongside the Granite Enduring Scale. And if you do raid, the All Totem Master is never a bad pickup, because again, you are typically dodging, and basically you're dodging attacks, right? But that pretty much covers it. So those are all of the trinkets that I would recommend, or that the top players are currently running in the game. Now, again, there are some standout trinkets for damage from dungeons and from raid that can be useful if you're, someone who's doing 10s or someone who's doing 15s. But if you want to be in a dungeon and you want to have the most amount of impact with your class, either dealing damage or surviving, these are kind of the trinkets that I would, highly suggest. So I hope that helps. If you have any recommendations down below, feel free to leave them in the comments for people to read. And lastly, I want to just give a huge shout out to my Patreons who allow me to actually make videos like this, because without them, well, I wouldn't be here. So thank you guys. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Take care.